There are few fantasy characters as iconic as Conan the Barbarian. The original short stories, written by Robert E. Howard in the 1930s, are genre-defining classics, and often credited as the inspiration for the term sword and sorcery. Since then, Conan has gone on to feature in novels, films, TV shows, and countless comics that have been going on since the 70s. He's also been the inspiration for board games, card games, tabletop role-playing games. Even today, he's a staple of the Marvel Comics lineup and has been palling around with the Avengers, while many of his supporting cast have gotten entire books and minis of their own. It's honestly hard to overestimate the amount of influence Conan has had on our popular culture. So with that in mind, I have to ask, why are almost all of his video games so terrible? I doubt that Howard ever imagined that his work would someday be the basis for major Hollywood movies or the inspiration for something like Age of Conan. Before we go through the history of Conan's video games, let's talk briefly about the history of the character. Making his debut in a 1932 issue of the pulp magazine Weird Tales, Conan is a leviathan of a man, a barbarian warrior, thief, pirate, and eventually king. His stories are numerous, and his exploits are thrilling tales of action, adventure, and a smidge of cosmic horror. These stories take place during the Barbarian Age, a fictional time period starting after the oceans drank Atlantis, but before the beginning of recorded history. Conan himself comes from the northern land of Samaria, a nation filled with savage tribes and clans. They're exactly what you think of when you think barbarians. Howard wrote an essay entitled The Hyborian Age that detailed many aspects of the Conan world. However, he only finished 21 Conan stories before his suicide in 1936. After his death, several publishers and writers kept the character alive, and Conan's popularity started to rise when, in 1970, Marvel Comics began putting out Conan the Barbarian. To this day, a lot of people know and love Conan best for these comics. It was this uptake in popularity, and the success of a certain space fantasy film with pulp adventure roots, that encouraged Universal to release a Conan the Barbarian movie in 1982 that would become incredibly influential in its own right. Now, after the success of the film, it was only natural that a sequel would be released, complete with a video game tie-in. And so we arrive at the very first game based on the character, Conan Hall of Volta, developed by the now defunct company Datasoft and released in 1984 for the Apple II and a bunch of other stuff. Look, I don't know how well this game sold, but it was released before the game industry recovered from the crash of 1983, and the reception section of its Wikipedia page is empty, so I'm just going to assume not super well. In the game, you play as Conan and attempt to storm the castle fortress of the evil Volta, who in the original Conan lore is, nobody. Wait, what? That's not even the bad guy in the movie that this was released alongside of. This is, supposedly, because the game was originally called Visigoth and had nothing to do with Conan. Well, this is definitely an Apple II game. Basically, you control Conan and infiltrate the castle by getting past the outer wall and then making your way into the castle through the caverns beneath. I say you control Conan, but, it's an Apple II game, so more accurately, you just sort of suggest that he should run left or right and maybe jump on occasion. And, maybe he'll do that. You're armed with 10 boomerang swords that you throw at Volta's minions, which mostly consists of bats, dragon birds, and these things. Navigating the castle will require Conan to gather keys and gems to open doors and interact with different parts of the castle. Eventually, he breaks one of the power sources for the castle and finds Volta in his lair. Conan puts 3 gems in the thing, and Volta's trapped bird is free to drop his captor in a pit of lava and give the barbarian a ride to safety. And that's the game. Like a lot of games for the Apple II and the Commodore 64, it's a basic and dated game that's incredibly clunky to revisit, and because of the archaic graphics, you can really only tell it's a Conan game because the game tells you it is. And while I can't really recommend it as a great game, I do think it's still in the spirit of the character. One of my favorite things about the world of Hyboria is that Conan is constantly presented with the fearsome and the bizarre. Stumbling upon a giant castle only to discover it's housing a mad scientist with a horde of minions fits right in with the tone of classic Conan stories like Tower of the Elephant. Honestly, I wish I had a little bit more to say about this one, but it can be beaten in under a half hour, and if I have to listen to this walking sound anymore, I'm gonna lose my mind. For the next few years, the franchise was fairly quiet. The last of the 80s Conan universe films, Red Sonja, came out in 1985, and after that, the Hyborian Age mostly existed in comics and tabletop games. I'm aware that the character that Arnold Schwarzenegger plays in this movie is not Conan the Barbarian, but it still takes place in the same universe, so don't even start. We wouldn't see Conan foray into the world of video games again until 1990, with the release of Conan, Mysteries of Time for the NES. Published by Mindscape, Mysteries of Time is actually a port of a Commodore 64 game called Myth, History in the Making. Mindscape took Myth, put in a Conan sprite, and pretty much called it a day. And, Hall of Volta was a dated product of its time, nothing spectacularly horrible, but nothing special. This one, though, is, it's bad. The game opens in a cavern, and Conan is immediately assaulted by skeletons and flying monsters. At the end of the cavern is a fire-breathing chimera that can only be killed by throwing a trident at it. Now, to get a trident, you have to pick it up from one of these demons, but first you have to get them to spawn. And the only way to get the demons to spawn is to cut down this skeleton with a sword, and the only way to get the sword is to punch other skeletons and hope that they drop a sword. Once the sword drops, you can pick it up by holding the attack button and then pressing down. God help you if you press down without holding the attack button, because doing that will make Conan leap forward with reckless abandon. For some reason. Also, the enemies infinitely respawn. For some reason. After killing the Chimera, Conan embarks on a journey throughout the ancient world, visiting different locales inspired by various cultures and nations. The presentation, in general, is a step down from the original game, Myth. The Commodore 64 and Amiga versions of Myth both have a HUD that at least makes sense. You can see your health, lives, currently equipped weapons, and total points. In Mysteries of Time, you get a gray rectangle with some lines and numbers. This general lack of polish extends to the gameplay as well. It feels incredibly clunky, and the pacing is all over the place. The second level is literally a straight shot that takes all of about a minute to get through, followed by this absolute nonsense of a boss battle filled with bottomless pits. None of these levels feel like they lead into each other in a natural way. You finish one only to be suddenly dropped into the next with no real rhyme or reason. It's a bad game, but not a horrible choice to use as the basis for a Conan game. Conan's world is made up of several nations, most of which are heavily based on or inspired by real civilizations. A journey across the ancient world, then, would just be a tour of Hyboria. These aren't Greek statues, they're Achelonian. Viewing the game through this lens, it makes sense that the final level would be set in Egypt. In the Hyborian Age, the land of Stygia is heavily based on the aesthetics and cultural iconography of ancient Egypt, and generally speaking, Stygians tend to be the bad guys in Conan stories, and they're often worshippers of the evil serpent god Set. I also like the number of bizarre creatures Conan fights in the game. The combat might feel obtuse and unresponsive, but at least you get to kill a lot of interesting things. Level 5, for example, takes place in a forest, where you have to fight off several monsters that look like satyrs before coming face to face with a big dragon. Ultimately, though, these games are footnotes in Conan's video game history. They're ports or retoolings of existing games that only feel and look like Conan if you squint hard enough. I would argue that the first true attempt at a Conan game would arrive in 1991, when Virgin Games released Conan the Cimmerian, developed by Synergistic Software. Oh yes. Alright, it's Conan time. This honestly feels so much more like Conan right out the gate. Well, except that Conan isn't usually a blacksmith from the town of Erskald. But Conan also has a different backstory in like every piece of media about him, so whatever. We open on the town and see it's a quaint, happy place with people going about their lives. Conan's hot wife opens the window, presumably so the neighbors can properly appreciate her massive cleavage, before heading out to smith things with her husband Conan. But oh no! Marauding horsemen are approaching the village! Conan's wife is murdered as they raid the village, and Conan vows revenge. Pretty straightforward. Now this guy here is Thoth Amon, a Stygian wizard and worshipper of Set. This is actually pretty cool because Thoth Amon is generally considered to be sort of an arch nemesis for Conan, even though he only appears in one of the original stories. Visually though, he looks a lot more like the villain from the Conan movie, Tulsa Doom. Tulsa Doom, of course, isn't actually a character from the original Conan stories. Instead, he originates from stories about one of Robert E. Howard's other characters, Kull the Conqueror, whose adventures take place before the sinking of Atlantis. Where that gets extra strange is that the movie's take on Tulsa Doom is clearly more inspired by Thoth Amon, but they still went with the name Tulsa Doom. Now, I have a couple theories on why that might be. First, I think that obviously Tulsa Doom is a name that sounds more threatening when spoken out loud. Also, Tulsa Doom is usually described as...
3 hours later.
Okay, where were we? Right, Conan for DOS. Conan travels to the capital city of Zamora, Shadizar, which could pretty accurately be described as a wretched hive of scum and villainy. This is where the game really starts. As Conan, you're free to explore the city in something that feels a bit like an old-school RPG mixed with a point-and-click adventure game. You can talk to NPCs, head inside several of the buildings, and generally just explore. This actually makes a lot of sense for a Conan game. Conan stories already read like side quests in a giant RPG, so having a more free-form and open game is actually a good fit. Now, I was surprised how many doors in the first area could be opened and how many locations there were to see. If old school MS-DOS games are your thing and you like Conan, this might be the best game in the world. Unfortunately, this one isn't really that much more fun to play than the first two. I respect the ambition here, and it's definitely the first decent Conan experience in the gaming world, but it is hard to go back to. Combat feels like a bizarre game of rock, paper, scissors, with Conan needing to know specific attacks, and sometimes even needing specific weapons to win fights. And like a lot of old school RPGs and adventure games, it also relies heavily on the player keeping their wits about them. There are no compass arrows to follow, just directions told to you. Personally, I love that kind of stuff, and it definitely adds some charm to a fairly tedious experience. Eventually, of course, Conan is able to beat Thoth Amon and take the jeweled throne.
To sit on my throne as the Prince of Bel-Air.
Conan would mostly sit out the rest of the 90s, with the original Marvel Comics line ending in 1993. There was a short-lived live-action TV show in the late 90s, but the Hyborian Age wouldn't really see much new material until late 2003, when Dark Horse began publishing Conan. This run adapted several classic Conan stories, like The Frost Giant's Daughter, and one of my personal favorites, The God in the Bowl. 1 year later, in 2004, we would get our next Conan game, aptly titled Conan, developed by Cauldron and published by TDK Media Active. I say we got it, but actually it was only ever released in Europe, so yeah, unfortunately I wasn't really able to get much hands-on time with this one. The others I was at least able to play, but this one I had a hard time getting access to. So, big thanks to the folks who upload long plays of this one. The game is Basically a bog standard hack and slash with some puzzle elements. Since I wasn't really able to play it much, I can't fully speak to how bad it might be, but for Conan's first 3D outing, it seems like a solid effort. The presentation isn't half bad for the time, and Conan looks appropriately black-haired and sullen-eyed. The various weapons and armor you get are a nice touch, and he even gets a female companion, which is actually pretty common for Conan. While the game doesn't look horrible by any stretch, it's difficult to get a hold of and hasn't aged terribly well. And besides, its particular mark on Conan history was pretty quickly overshadowed by the next game on our list, Conan, developed by Nihilistic Software and released by THQ in 2007. This is arguably the first attempt at something resembling a AAA Conan game. Nihilistic was already known as the team behind Vampire the Masquerade Redemption and Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects. And THQ is THQ, the publisher behind classics like Red Faction and weirder cult hits like Destroy All Humans. So this is actually a pretty great lineup for a new Conan game. And even better, Nihilistic wanted to make this a brutal action experience, inspired by the likes of God of War. They also took a lot of care in the presentation, basing their designs off the work of renowned Conan illustrator Frank Frazetta, and hiring the always amazing Ron Perlman to voice the titular hero.
I am Conan. I serve no man. You, uglier than the rest. Will you come to life as well?
The game was lined up to be the best Conan game yet, and you know what? It was. But that's not really saying much. The game opens with Conan exploring a tomb and fighting some ghosts. He finds this really foreboding statue and decides that smashing it would probably be a good idea. This, of course, unleashes some horrible, evil monstrosity that he's gonna have to deal with. After washing up on a nearby shore, he fights his way through some pirates and meets a woman named Akana, who basically serves as the Valeria or Belit of this story. Conan often finds himself working with strong women. Howard was, most argue, very feminist for his time, and a lot of Conan's most remembered characters are women, so it was really great to see Nihilistic bring that into the story of their game. Also, she's voiced by Chloe Fraser from Uncharted, and that's just kinda neat.
You dare speak to me this way? I could kill you in an instant.
The two team up to find a way to stop the Black Death, a curse created by Akana's father, the evil wizard Graven. This evil wizard being the monstrosity that Conan freed in the beginning of the game. So that's the basic setup. Time to hack and slash our way across Hyboria. Combat here isn't bad exactly, but it's not great. It's God of War light mixed with being able to pick up weapons you find, kind of like Prince of Persia Warrior Within. And these are both great ideas in theory. God of War's brand of brutal melee combat would be right at home in the Conan universe, and Conan will often use whatever sharp thing is closest as a weapon. Basically, you've got a button for fast attacks and a button for heavy attacks. You can string them together for combos and use the right stick to dodge roll. It's just God of War, except nothing really ever feels satisfying. Hits don't feel good when they connect, and everything has a level of clunkiness and stiffness to it. This is made worse by the enemy design. Enemies often attack in groups, which would be fine if it weren't for the fact that their hits knock you out of your current attack and stun you for a second, which on its own isn't necessarily bad game design. But because of this, when fighting groups, it's easy to get stun locked into oblivion by a gang of swordsmen who are all making the same attack in quick succession. Then when you go on the offensive, they block. A lot. Which again, isn't bad, but fights with tougher enemies can quickly dissolve into block their combo, get in a hit or two until they start blocking, block their combo again, get in a hit or two, repeat until someone dies. And using either the single longsword, the great sword, or the dual swords doesn't really do much to shake this up. And what's that? God of War also has QuickTime events? Well, we've got those too, only they're stupider. You want a 3-button QTE just to open a door? We've got you covered. This is a God of War clone in the most obnoxious ways, but it only clocks in at a merciful 5 hours or so, and at the end of the day, I've played worse. There are lots of combos to learn, plenty of enemies to fight, minor level puzzles to solve, and big enemies to slay. And, yeah, lots of topless women to save.
My clothes! Where are my clothes?
Okay. See, Nihilistic also felt that without a high level of violence and nudity, it wouldn't feel like an authentic Conan experience, and to a degree they're not wrong. One of the things that separates the Hyborian Age from other fantasy worlds like Middle-earth is the sheer brutality of it. Conan's universe doesn't shy away from the horrors of mankind, and it makes no attempt to shy away from sexuality either. In Queen of the Black Coast, Belit, the pirate queen, is described as being topless when Conan first meets her. The same is true in The Frost Giant's Daughter. But the women in those stories have agency and character. The women here are just captives, and that makes the nudity feel less like a natural part of the world and more like fan service. Even Akana has to be rescued later in the game.
The woman is ours.
Blast your hides! Come any closer and I'll kick your teeth in!
So, yeah, A for effort, but I think they missed the mark on this one a little bit. They got the violence down, though. Despite my misgivings, this is ultimately the best game we've covered so far. And it'll be the last one we talk about because after this game we enter the Funcom era, starting with the critically praised MMO Age of Conan. Age of Conan would become a pretty huge success, catapulting Funcom to release the survival game Conan Exiles and an RTS game called Conan Unconquered, none of which have been bad, just very different experiences from previous Conan titles. I still think we have yet to see the perfect Conan game. Up until the Funcom era, his games were wholly singular experiences, giving us just one of Conan's many adventures. Personally, I always thought the world of Conan would be best suited to a massive, story-driven RPG in the vein of The Witcher, a game that allows us to experience his many exploits, both grand and simple, as Conan fulfills his destiny to become king of Aquilonia. But for now, I'm more than satisfied to look back on the history of the Cimmerian warrior and eagerly await the next chapter in his grand adventure.